Welcome to what I consider a particularly personally meaningful and important in the room. And that is because we are doing it tonight with my beautiful, beautiful friend and fellow Tay-Sachs mom, Myra Sack. My husband, Charlie, and I came to know Myra and her husband, Matt, very shortly after their daughter Havi's diagnosis with infantile Tay-Sachs. Our daughter Cameron also had infantile Tay-Sachs, and we live only a few miles apart. So it was in that capacity that we were introduced, and Charlie and I had the honor and privilege of traveling near to Myra and Matt from diagnosis onwards with Havi, and can see them as often as we possibly can now. It is not often that I know someone as well as I do know Myra and Matt when we do this conversation. So that's like the disclosure. Myra is the author of the memoir that just came out this week, today, I think. 57 Fridays, Losing Our Daughter and Finding Our Way. It is a beautiful memoir. Myra is going to talk about it, and then I'm going to ask Myra some questions, and then we're going to pivot to the work she's doing now based on everything she learned and felt and feels strongly about that she learned from Havi and her time with Havi and in the years that have followed. Okay. So without further ado, hello, Myra. It's a privilege to have you here. If you would just start, please, by as succinctly as you can, telling the story of how the story of this book up until just how do you do this brief synopsis of the story, and then why did you choose to turn it into a book?
First, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who know what it means to be a mom whose child has died, I'm really grateful that you're here, and so sorry that you know this so deeply. And also thank you to those who are pausing the Caitlin Clark showdown. I am an athlete myself, and I understand what it's like to have to turn towards something else. So Havi's story, and the one that I tell in 57 Fridays, is about the life and death of our daughter Havi, who was born 2 years to the day of our Matt, my husband, and our wedding anniversary. She was born September 4th, 2018. And the first year of her life was relatively normal. We were first-time parents trying to keep our type A tendencies at bay. And although Havi was missing some developmental milestones, she certainly was just a gorgeous, active, graceful, fun, exhausting 1-year-old. And then at about a year, she was diagnosed with developmental delay, and that sort of catapulted a diagnostic odyssey that first resulted in a cerebral palsy diagnosis, and then a fatal Tay-Sachs diagnosis, which was not only devastating, was also quite shocking, because Matt and I, both of whom are Ashkenazi Jewish, had been tested before we were pregnant with Havi, because we knew about the devastating nature of the disease, and that thanks to all of the work that had come really in the 1970s, we could get preconception genetic testing. And unfortunately, a physician ordering error had been made on Matt's test, and he was misreported as not a carrier. So then we were faced with the moment where we learned that Havi was going to have a year or so to live, and the question became how we would do that. And I think we'll talk a little bit about some of the rituals that were sustaining to us And the book is about really a way of being. It's about the power of community. It's about what I think is this language of loss that can be learned to support others. And ultimately, it's just a testament to the fact that I think heartache and joy and beauty can really live side by side. So
Yeah, I will say that as that comes through very clearly in the book. And I also can testify that that is what I saw in Matt and Myra. Um, Myra, I will say that I will admit that it was a little painful for me to read at times because um, there was such an immediacy you bring forward. It's so the immediacy of your moments, um, because of the quality of your writing and how evocative it is. I really felt that I was there with you. And of course, there was also a familiarity for me because that was to some extent, you and Matt were a little bit like me and Charlie 20 years prior. So in many ways, it made what happened to me feel very recent. It also made it feel different. The things that resonated that I recognized were sort of the leaning in and breathing and inhaling my daughter, knowing that because of the irreparable nature and untreatable nature of the disease, knowing that she was going to die. But yet there were things in your book that you did that I wish I had done. And that really struck me. I reflected on how there were ways that you and Matt parented your daughter that I wish I had brought more to my experience. And I think if I'd read your book before going through it with Cameron, I might have done some of it a little differently. And I'm not beating myself up at all, but just the extent to which you really sat with such intentionality and felt your feelings and tolerated your feelings intentionally. It was striking to me to see how firmly and constantly you considered everything, which I think is part of what you promote in about what we are capable of is our capacity to tolerate things. And I also want to observe that that takes a lot of courage, Myra. And what brings me to the question of, was there a part of you that was afraid that the stronger or more you held Javi, the more heartbreaking it would be to let her go?
I think that I've given a lot of thoughts to that emotion of fear. And I think ultimately that fear is an emotion with an energy that promotes stagnancy. And when human energy is stagnant, it's hard to experience vitality and growth. And in contrast, I think what I felt compelled to lean into was this emotion of yearning, of which has so much more. I think its definition is rooted in eagerness and craving. And that, I think, is all we can ask for ourselves and for others, is how we can bring and promote vitality in moments that feel so scary. And so, of course, there were moments, and there still are moments, when all I want to do is cling and attach and hold. And the devastating reality of a fatal diagnosis is that we know that relationship to our person in any kind of physical or material way cannot be held. And so it becomes a question of how to move with them in a totally different way that never, if I think about, I know we've reflected on sort of how I think about before and after. And this is a little bit of a nod to Matt, who always groups his thoughts in threes, anyone who knows him. And I really like the way his brain works, so I'll try, which is that my before and after, I think, has 3 parts. Part 1 is before Havi, and that for me was all about possibility and some performance anxiety even, and purpose, like what's my purpose? And it was all sort of future oriented. And then Havi came to be, and that was the motherhood phase, the beginning of what was motherhood. And that is perspective shifting in a way that I wouldn't have appreciated. And then part 3 was motherhood reimagined when Havi was diagnosed. And that was about, and still is about, what John Kabat-Zinn, he's sort of the father of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and I've become infatuated with some of his work, but he calls this rotation in consciousness. And so in the moment of Javi's diagnosis, I was like flipped upside down, you know, my whole way of being. No longer was it about what's the next thing to do to achieve. It's about how to be present, and anything that was being measured in time was about either presence or eternity. And I think that's kind of the space that that I'm living in this sort of phase 3. And sometimes it's okay and I get it right, and other times I spin back. But it's always in rotation.
Oh, okay. We're gonna have to, we'll send this in the follow-up notes, everyone, so you don't have to remember that, because those 3s were, I've not heard that before, and I love that. We're jumping ahead to a question I had for later, but I want to, like, are you able to, how have you been able to bring into your present these several years since Javi died, and you are actively parenting 2 beautiful children, Kaya and Ezra? How have you been able to, how do you bring what you learned then into where you are now without the physical presence of Javi, whose physical presence was a constant reminder? And I will just say, and a legitimate buffer from the rest of the world. Like when I remember when Cameron was alive, I could be in my bubble. And then after she died, the bubble shifted a little because she wasn't here anymore. And so how has that been for you?
Well, there are too many people on this call who know me so well that I can't lie at all here, which is that a lot of times I'm not very good at it. I think many moments was my best self in that kind of phase, that early phase of motherhood reimagined. And I think that there are a handful of ways of being that are definitely always sort of right, if not at the surface of my day-to-day existence, just a scratch away. And I think the first is about staying close to pain. And that is something that I use and return to often now as a bereavement care provider and a friend, and a partner and a mother, which is that we have to be able to access our own pain so that we can connect with someone else's pain, even if we don't share the same experience. We can relate to an excruciating knee buckling pain and then show up in a way that is authentic, much differently than if we distance ourselves. And Blyth, you said something about how intimate and painful sometimes reading 57 Fridays was. And I think part of why I didn't even know why I was writing it for public consumption when I was, but now I think for me, it's so important to find companions, whether that's in the form of text or human, that are where that intimacy barrier is dissolved and we can be really close. And And I think that that helps us all feel seen in a way that is different from some level of sometimes BS that exists with this kind of toxic positivity culture or resilience enforcing culture that I think misconstrues resilience. Anyway, I'm digressing, but the second is being gentle with ourselves when engaging in the land of the living and in the material world and in the day-to-day actually feels good, and giving ourselves grace when that happens. And I think that that's so important because that's some of what makes it really hard for them not to be here anymore, right? Like, because this land of the living is so rich, even with, you know, even with the things that the endless Zoom calls, or the superficiality elements, but that's this. And so giving ourselves permission to be, to feel joy in those moments. And then I think a third is about setting intention when moving into spaces. And intention comes from the Latin tendere, and my mom is a linguist and far better than I am, but she sort of taught me at an early age to like understand language. So I'm trying, Mom, but the word intention, the root is tendere, and tendere means to stretch. And when we engage in physical activity, we know that we need to stretch in order to perform. And the same, I think, is true for emotional work. And oftentimes for me as a bereaved person, existing in spaces where I feel like an outsider or other, requires me to move in and out of those spaces with intention so that I have kind of my full heart, my full being open to experience it as it needs to be, or as I need it to be. Does that answer the question?
It does. And that assumes, I mean, I think that there's practice that right? The more you do it, it's a muscle, the more faith you can have that one can do that. In stretching, you can still be safe. Like your grief is not threatened. And what you need to keep or protect is not threatened by that. So I know we're going to get to the title of the book, which will lead us into an important conversation about ritual. But before we do that, I do want to ask whether you and Matt were always on the same page with how you were living with and experiencing the sadness and the sorrow and the fear, and ways that if there were pockets of times where you were not, how you brought each other. And I'm thinking also about the how you used Caring Bridge, because I think that is real connected. If you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think at the deepest level, we were and are always connected and aligned. We aligned early on, in large part, thanks to you and Charlie, on how we were going to be with this diagnosis, and that we were going to take care of Havi at home, and that we were going to follow her lead, and that intuition, we could trust intuition, and that we could be in conversation with someone who could never speak a word. The level beneath that, in terms of how we were grieving, often or sometimes took different forms. And I became incredibly interested in grief theory and literature, and also spirituality and mysticism and poetry. And so sort of being in a space of bibliotherapy was important for me, and engaging in the grief work in a cognitive way, as well as at an emotional level, was how I was intuiting my way through the experience, and still do. And I think Matt was, and he can interrupt me if I get this wrong, I think was at times more of an instrumental griever, where he was the one who was sort of doing all of the blocking and tackling so that we could exist in the way that we both felt like we needed to, and that Javi deserved to. And so there were moments when we were missing each other in terms of what we were needing. And the thing that always existed though, and that still does, is we knew we had to be in conversation about what was most important. And we had an ongoing dialogue throughout the time of Javi's diagnosis until her death and now. And that conversation often started in the morning, the first thing in the morning, when we would say, what do you need today to be okay? And that question is actually quite spiritual, and practical. And what do you need to be okay? And sometimes that would be, I need a 5-minute walk. I need to eat a healthy meal. I need time and space with Javi without Kaya. But it was a moment of connection where we were asking ourselves and each other what we needed, and we committed to honoring that, which I think was helpful.
It's very beautiful. And do you still do that?
Yeah, we do. I would say not a daily practice, but definitely. And when there's space between us, it's often an easy way to bring us back together.
Can you talk a little bit about how you both used Caring Bridge? And then I'm going to connect that to the involvement, the sort of define the scope of your friends and family that really encircled you. And we'll talk about that. And then we'll get to ritual, because it was with friends and family that you really blew up in a fabulous, like the giant glow up of Shabbirthday. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, Matt's sister Maggie sent us a note about a website called Caring Bridge, and thought that it would be a platform that could be helpful for us to share Javi's life with people who loved her but couldn't get to her. We were in COVID, and also people were scattered all over and couldn't be with Javi in a daily way, the way that they never would have needed to be if her lifespan was sort of more normal. But now there was real urgency to getting to know and love her. And so we started by writing to her. Every entry started with Dear Beauty, and we sort of fell into a pattern of alternating weeks. So I would take 1 week and Matt would take the next. And it became a way of sharing, of first reflecting for ourselves about what had just happened and what were we feeling about it. And then an outgrowth of it was learning how the other partner was experiencing a set of feelings, or was experiencing moments in ways that I don't know if we would have had we not had writing as a form of self-expression. So yeah, it became a really powerful connection between the two of us, and then Blyth, as you're gesturing at among our community.
Well, what was so striking to me, because I was a reader of the Caring Bridge, was long before you decided to start emotion, long before you decided to move into grief education for yourself, and before you wrote 57 Fridays, it was clear in your Caring Bridge that you and Matt were educating yourself and educating anybody else reading it about grief, without even just the expression, the modeling, the processing on the page, the vulnerability, the willingness to name the pain. all of it, and also to talk about all the beautiful things, like many of the entries, most of the entries describe beautiful, happy, joyful moments, and then also the part that's very painful. And it was the grief education that you were, the self-education that was happening because you were willing to do it, willing to touch it. And then for your readers, that was an education. It was grief education for anybody who was reading your Caring Bridge. It really was. And I think I remember, you know, well, your siblings came, it was COVID, this was easier. It was an extraordinary, Matt and Myra's family showed up in exceptional ways, and I'm sure they would show up in exceptional ways no matter what. And it was slightly abetted by the fact that it was COVID and everybody could work from home. So people moved to surround Matt and Myra within walking distance, which was an extraordinary thing. Which gave me the opportunity to talk to Jacob, your brother. And I remember him saying to me, Myra and Matt are letting us know how they're feeling and what they need. And they're leading and they're telling us how we need to support them. And they're educating us along the way. And they gave you the book. You gave them all the book, Bearing the Unbearable. So you are helping them help you, which I think is not typical and is definitely a recommended tactic once I saw that in action. Can you talk a little bit about helping your loved ones help you, or how you did it, or if you were even aware that that's what you were doing?
Yeah, it's interesting because now I feel like the reason why I want people to read 57 Fridays is because I want them to see that community can be such a lifeline, and that we don't often talk about in grief support how fundamental social support is for grieving people, even though it's one of the 5 prerequisites essentially in ensuring that someone can be on a healing journey. And I think we oftentimes talk about grief as intimate and leave out the intimate and social part of the experience of being human and being so broken. So the part of sort of being on a grief education journey with this community started from one of my parents' close friends, who's a professor, sent us a book called Bearing the Unbearable, which arrived a few weeks after Javi's diagnosis. And I had already been through a handful of grief books that really didn't speak to me. And then this one did. And so it was a moment when I felt like I could trust myself and I could trust my emotions in a way that was so empowering. And actually on the self-trust piece, just because I think it's a relevant note to name, which is Freud, the father of psychiatry, was among the first to provide an analysis on grief in the clinical population. And he was known for decathexis, which is the process of disinvesting of mental or emotional energy in a person or an object, that there had to be this letting go. And that became sort of a cornerstone of Freud and grief. And he was the first really of the foundational grief theorists. What is often left out, but so important, is what Freud then went on to say when he lost his own daughter and grandchild. And in anticipating this conversation, I wrote it down because I think it is important in the context of self-trust, where he was writing this letter to a friend of his who had just experienced another traumatic death. And he writes, "No matter what may come to take its place, even if it should fill that place completely, it remains something else. And that's how it should be. it's the only way of perpetuating a love that we do not want to abandon, that we can't abandon. And so there Freud was contradicting his own theory that many were following. And I raise it now because that part of self-trust in grief became our anchor. And we were using that to guide ourselves and others in our journey, which was that our anguish and our devastation was the deepest thing. And anyone who couldn't understand that, who couldn't come close enough to it, for the moment, wasn't going to be in our space. And Charlie, I remember a really important conversation with Charlie about, who just making sure that we were keeping people in the bubble who could orient around Havi. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a Freud got quite a few things wrong, as we now know, and that was clearly one of them. And it's often we learn when we go through something. You touched upon something that somebody asked in the chat, whether there were people who were in your circle or who you thought might be who were in your circle, but then couldn't be, not your inner circle, but people who disappointed you, or ways that they weren't able to show up for you in ways that you needed, and how you handled that.
I think that what started to happen was developing some kind of boundary that we had to abide by. And that was really different from, and is different from, my nature, which is relatively accommodating and at times deferential and appeasing. And so it was difficult to not engage, not give of myself, not share Javi with people who didn't know how to be with her in the way that I needed them to be, or the way that I felt like they deserved. She deserved. But at the time, those boundaries were easier to set because she was in my arms, and there was just no compromising. Now it's a different phase, which is, how do we learn how to reintegrate those people in a way that's authentic? And in that case, I think some of my friendships where there was distance during Javi's life and immediately after her death have now come closer because we've had honest conversations about limitations, emotional limitations and capacities, or logistical ones. And I feel like that's okay too. And that's a new space for me, for sure, where those boundaries aren't so rigid.
One of my closest friends from growing up really let me down during Cameron's life. And I think one of the bravest things I did was have a conversation with her a few years after Cameron died, and said, you let me down, and I understand that you were limited by whatever it was that was limiting you. And I know you love me and we'll get back there, but I need you to know that that hurt me. And it was a very therapeutic conversation for her, because she knew she let me down, but she didn't know how to broach it. And I made it a conversation that I made that conversation possible. And it was a bridge back to where we both wanted to get, because I showed her that I still loved her and knew she did the best she could, and that in that moment it wasn't good enough. I named it, and that told her I still loved her. And we talked it out. And that is something I do recommend for anyone who's been disappointed, but still has the capacity to make that connection, that if you show that you can tolerate, if you can talk about it, you give them permission to talk about it back. I think I saw that.
Yeah.
All right. There are a few things that I've asked you to read. Oh, no. people have to buy the book, they can read it. We can get to that later if there's time. Please talk about the power of ritual and why the title of this book. Hello.
Okay. So 57 Fridays comes from the idea that Matt and I had a few days after Havi was diagnosed, which was to combine the fact that Havi was only going to have 2 birthdays with the notion that we get to honor the Sabbath, celebrate Shabbat every Friday. And so if we combined forces and created what we called Shabbirthday, how many Shabbirthdays could we honor and celebrate with Havi while she was still on this earth? And we ended up having 57 of them. And this incredible community of my family and closest people made those 57 Shabbirthdays the most exquisite Fridays I've ever had, and the holiest ones. And the decision to do that felt so easy in the context of such heartbreak. And yet the advice that we got from a rabbi when we shared this idea with her was that we shouldn't consider doing this. And when we asked her why, she said, because it's going to be too painful to experience the Sabbath then after Havi dies. And she is a rabbi who I respect and admire so much, and yet she was caught up in this fear of culture that I think so often keeps us from doing the thing that we actually need and want to do, which is to move toward something that is painful and beautiful and hard and full. And she was afraid. And ultimately, I'm really glad that we didn't take her advice, because 57 Fridays became the way we lived, and that I couldn't bear more than a week's worth of time before I needed to do some kind of deep spiritual cleansing, emotional expressing with people who loved Havi so much. And I think that the power of ritual is something that I've given a lot of thought to. And one kind of line that comes to my mind is from Rachel Naomi Remen, who talks about energy follows belief. She says, energy follows belief. And to me, ritual is the embodiment of that concept. And it gives us a container for this deep belief that we can honor and celebrate with people when someone is dying and shouldn't be. And it became the ultimate act of integration, which is another thing really going for ritual, I think, which is why I've become such a fan, is that when we can integrate, we avoid the opposite of that, which is disintegrate. Dis, the prefix, is to cut off or exclude. And if we do that, we run the risk of disintegrating. And instead, we can learn to integrate the people who have died into our lives in a kind of dosed, moderate, predictable way, which Dr. Bruce Perry talks a lot about, that the nature of those kinds of experiences, in that they're dosed, moderate, and predictable, as really healing. And because the opposite is severe or long or unpredictable. And we know that for someone who's grieving or someone who's experiencing traumatic loss, the most harmful thing is something that is unpredictable. So I think ritual provides this really safe rhythm to our days and our weeks that we still use today. So Shabbirthdays obviously are the kind of cornerstone, but blueberry smoothies were the food that literally sustained and nourished Havi. And for about a year after her death, I would make one every morning because I needed to hear the blender. My brother, who's on the call, I think still makes one. And other rituals that are micro rituals, but equally as powerful. Javi died on a Wednesday, and so every Wednesday at 9:04, which is the time of her death, my incredible siblings send a text message with a photo of Javi or multiple, and it's a way to preserve the holiness of Wednesdays. And it's been 3 years since she's died. So I think those acts of integration are, for me, are incredibly healing, because what they do is they tell us that the person who died still matters, still can exist in ordinary ways, not in the extraordinary ways that we can't operate at that level of, I think, exquisite holiness every day. Unless we are monks, which I did think about. But I don't think I would be a very good monk. So anyway.
Matt might actually protest, and two children might have something to say about that.
There's some logistics that would be complicated. Yeah.
I love so many of the words you're using, integration being one of them, because those are very positive and affirming words that, grief has a fearful overtone to it, or we've been programmed to be afraid, to want to avoid grief, to be afraid of it. And yet words like integration and the power of ritual, to touch it and own it and sit with it and lean into it, is a very affirming and positive and inviting. Those are positive and inviting words that counter program what we've societally come to fear about grief. Myra, you everything you learned during Javi's life, and you were, as I mentioned, you were you were educating yourself and your family about, and your friends, your inner circle, and me. You were educating me, and I'd been through it, and I still was learning from you and Matt, which was very powerful for me. About grief. And then Javi died, and you continued to touch it and sit with it and learn from it and grow and not be afraid. And now you are growing into working in directly as a one-on-one grief educator. And also you've started a nonprofit called Emotion. Would you talk please a little bit about what Emotion is? And in the context of Emotion, embed any, how would you remember everything you've touched upon? But the extent to which Emotion incorporates what in your book is the afterword, your hard-learned lessons about grief.
Yeah. Okay. Emotion is a new nonprofit organization. Blyth is a founding board member, thank goodness. And it is an organization that really grew out of Javi's life and death, and came from this idea that there were really 3 elements to healing. And I use healing not as a way to say that there is an end point, but healing as a way to say that there can be some sense of coherence in my world in a way that feels okay. And those 3 elements were movement, community, and ritual. And the importance of movement for us was incredibly regulating. And we didn't know why at the time, but now we do, which is that movement is regulating because it taps into this patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. And this comes from Dr. Bruce Perry's work again. And that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity that we do when we're running or walking or swimming or jumping is the same activity that we heard when we were in our mother's womb. And that activity has a stronger somatosensory memory than any shard of trauma that exists within us. And so it's no wonder that when we need to talk about something really hard, or we are anticipating a difficult moment, sometimes it's easier to do that on a walk than it is sort of sitting face to face. And so movement was sort of the first part of the elements of emotion. The second was community, which was this idea that there is a way to show up for people. There is a language we can learn. I'm not special in any way that I was able to learn a new language. I was privileged enough to be able to have the space and the resources to do it. And now I want to give back to others. And ritual is, I think, the most profound explanation for ritual is from Suki Miller, who says that ritual is the antidote to helplessness. And so I had this idea of combining those three elements in programmatic offerings. And so first piloted a group, an emotion group that met at Heartbreak Hill Running Company. And we together did a 10-week movement-based grief experience, which involved running together every week and then a series of gently guided grief prompts that people would get and experience throughout the weeks in between the group meetups. And at the end, the group would do a culminating experience and we would see what happened. And what we learned was that people grew to rely on, appreciate, need this community, and that it was different from a traditional grief group in that it was in motion and it was by design dosed, moderate, and predictable. So we were only talking about our grief for a very short period of time, and then we were getting moving. And so that was the pilot program. And then since then, we've built other services within emotion, which are grief literacy and education trainings for organizations and companies. And then a third programmatic offering of like sort of tragedy response that is less about crisis response in an acute sense of the word, but more about these community care models. How do you embed communities of care in systems that need them, like schools or teams? So we're a real work in progress, and there's a lot of energy and thoughtfulness behind the movement now.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot of energy and thoughtfulness. There is my husband Charlie was in the pilot, as he is a runner, and he joined you, and he was he was sort of the master. He didn't need it, and yet he got so much from it, and also marveled at what he beheld from the other participants and some of their breakthroughs, which I was present for one of the circles and heard a breakthrough that just blew my mind for a person. And it was definitely clear to me, because I've participated in grief groups, that clearly the physical act of the returning again and again and again, and the dosing and the repetitive nature, the circle and the dosing, small amount, and then the running was what made this breakthrough that I observed, just watched, possible. It just, I was like, yep, there's definitely a there. It's really powerful. For those of you who, I'm not even putting it in the notes, it'll go in a follow-up email about emotion, so you can look up what emotion is and consider how it might be useful in your community, or with either your community at whatever scale you operate. I do encourage you to look at emotion, and I really encourage you to get 57 Fridays, which is now available everywhere that you can order books. Please, books like this, I know from talking to Myra in the early days when she was pitching this book, and from other people who've written books, parents who have beautiful, important things to say with beautifully written words, that it is hard to get books like this published, which is really, really too bad. Myra has a great publisher with a great, that it worked out, but we need people to buy books like this so that books like this will be purchased, because will be published, because people assume that they're too sad and nobody wants to talk about them, and nobody wants to read them, and that's not true. And parents who are who Myra was, and who I was, and who some of us on this Zoom are, they need books like this to learn and to lean into, to help them do this very difficult job, because this book will help them. So that is my very earnest, authentic plug for this book. And without any further ado, I will open it up to, if anybody has questions, to turn your camera on, and I will take you off pin, Myra. And you're like,
Thank you
good.
so much.
And if people would please, Myra really would love to answer questions.
All right, Miss Myra Sack. How do you measure grief literacy? I would like to know.
It's a really good question. I saw it in the chat and was hoping you wouldn't follow up. Because
I see.
no, I think that there are a couple of really important components to being grief literate that I would love at some point to talk about how you measure someone's proficiency. But for now, I think it's important. One concept that's pretty important, I think, is this notion of dis versus re. Dis, the prefix that I referred to earlier, which means to exclude or cut off, and re, the prefix, which means again. And when we dismember someone, we are cutting them off from membership of community, and that's really painful. And so every time we don't name a person who has died, every time we don't invite a person into spaces where their parents might want them to be named or honored, we are unintentionally dismembering them, and that's incredibly painful. In contrast, when we remember, we are actively participating in the process of bringing them into spaces again and again, into community again and again. And that's what happens every Wednesday when I get a text message, or someone orders a coffee in Javi's name and gets to hear the barista say it out loud. Those are small acts of remembering. And that same concept applies to disconnecting or reconnecting. So that's one. I think the second concept that feels really important is this idea that actually this is an equation of suffering equals pain times resistance. And so if resistance is 0, we know what happens to suffering. And so when we can be with pain and we can let go of the resistance, we can be in much less, I think, insufferable sort of spaces. And then the third is this, what I think is a story that we tell ourselves about grief in this country, which is that because everyone's grief journey is so unique and so personal, we can't possibly engage, we can't get close, we can't show up, we can't support. And I think that that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help?
Yep.
Yes, sure.
Okay.
So, Myra, can you go for a few minutes after, so we can stay on for a few more minutes?
Yes. And of course you don't have to.
Yes, no, no forced march here, but please,
Hey,
I,
Mai.
oh, yes, Charlie, do you want to talk?
Yeah, I was just thinking about you two talking about how beautiful and important the writing that Matt and Myra did was for each other and for their relationship. And you were sharing that with others, which was an incredible way to bring your circle into Javi's weekly life. And there was a part of it that was, I'm realizing now, a way for you to process each of you and with each other and as a couple. And it just struck me, I wonder if you could talk about that really personal part of the writing, because I'm realizing there must be other ways people can do that. If they're writers, they're writers. If they're drawers, they're drawers. If they're runners, they're runners. But when we're in it, having something that you can take to process seems really important. And I feel like I'm seeing that part of the writing for you and Matt in a new way tonight.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, I think for me, it became a little bit of a mirror, a way to, when I would write the words "Dear Beauty" and not lift the pen and not judge myself, and as Beverly D'Onofrio, who was the first formal writing teacher I had, who fired me after a few sessions, but because I wasn't taking the craft seriously enough. She said specificity is generosity. And I think for me, writing became a way to be as specific as I possibly could about what I was feeling. And now I appreciate the power of that. And it's supported by work that I've become really interested in from Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's at Northeastern, and she studies emotional granularity. And emotional granularity is all about moving away from these broad bins, operating in these broad bins of emotion, like happiness or sadness, and instead being as specific as possible about what we're feeling. That if it's not happiness, is it joy? Is it optimism? Is it, and really trying to sort of get underneath exactly where we are, because then it allows us to do something with it. And the same is true for kind of the stereotypical negative emotions, that once we really become conscious of them, we can work with them. And it's when we're not conscious that they can wreak havoc on us. So I think that's, in hindsight, maybe that's what it was doing.
The specificity piece, the granularity piece. Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense. Anybody else? We have some other grief educators on this Zoom I happen to recognize, if anybody wants to ask a question or make.
I have a question. So, I have a daughter who has a diagnosis where, eventually she's going to pass away. But we got it like 5 years ago, so there's no like set time frame. And I'm really struggling with, not projecting and, remaining hopeful and things like that, but embracing where we are or accepting where we are. And it's just so hard sometimes. So I was wondering, maybe is there something that you could recommend, like some kind of starting place? Because I feel like I've just spin my wheels daily thinking about what could happen, as opposed to like really living in the present and enjoying her and accepting where we are and just all the things you talked about. So I guess I should have said first, thank you so much for the work that you've done. And I don't know where I've been, but I've been getting these emails for years, probably since I got my daughter's diagnosis, and I just happened to, register for this tonight. So thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you. I would love to know your daughter's name.
Oh, Dominique.
Dominique. How old is she?
She is 26.
Wow.
And yeah, she started having some symptoms probably like around age 18, and I didn't know what was going on. So we got some genetic testing done, and that's when we got, the diagnosis for her. And probably over the last year, I'm really starting to see some declines. Um, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I've also made the decision of her to not live with me just because caretaking has been so much. But I'm starting to really regret that because I feel like I'm missing out.
Wow.
That is
Well,
so honest of you, Pamela. I mean, that's
yeah. It's obvious that you're an exquisite mother, and I'm really, really grateful that you're here, and I hope that we can continue talking after tonight. And I think maybe I would start from a place of this desire to accept, I think, flies in the face of the fact that it's really that there is this inner protestation of a mother who has learned that their child is going to die too soon, and giving that inner protestation space and talking to it, even personifying it, naming it, who is it, and starting to turn towards that, I think will give you permission to be with what is an impossibly brutal and devastating reality. And then once you have space for that, then you can and will, and probably already are, finding all of these micro moments to embrace your relationship, which is a different one than you imagined. And that is never anything that you're going to be able to accept, because it's so, the only word that comes to mind is not a good one. It's so fucked up. And I think own that, and then move with it and give yourself grace along the way.
yeah. And just to build on what Myra said, Pamela, I would add that the fact that it is best for your daughter and you that she not live with you for some very practical reasons having to do with the magnitude of care that she requires doesn't mean that you are not cherishing the days of her life. She doesn't have to live in your home for you to be cherishing the days of her life. And I think that's a really important thing for you to eventually believe through processes that Myra has talked about tonight, so that you really do come to believe that and feel it.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to end this evening. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you all so much for being here. Myra, thank you so much for your time and for writing this beautiful book and sharing it.
Thank you. Blythe, thank you for having me. It feels so right that being with you and being with Charlie and Deirdre and Taylor and my family and my closest friend, Sam, from home. And I mean, it's Mary, it's amazing that this is kind of the launch of Havi going public. And so just thank you all for being in this space with us. And yeah.